She was left to die for a crime she never committed. Chained beneath a dying tree, abandoned by everyone who should have protected her, Lyra had already stopped waiting for a miracle. But somewhere in that kingdom, someone else had spent his whole life being left behind too, and he wasn't about to let her disappear the way he almost had. If you've ever felt invisible, unchosen, replaceable, stay close. This is where their story begins. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and let's find out together what happens next. The village was still waking when the soldiers arrived, their boots striking the cobblestones hard enough to silence the roosters mid-crow. Lyra had just stepped outside with an empty clay jug, her long chestnut hair still loose from sleep, when 4 armed men surrounded her without warning. "Lyra Ashwin," the captain said, not as a question but as a verdict that had already been decided long before sunrise. "You're coming with us." The jug slipped from her hands and shattered across the stone. "What crime?" she demanded, forcing strength into a voice that suddenly felt far too small. "What have I done?" No one answered. Neighbors slowly emerged into their doorways, whispering in frightened voices. Some looked at her with pity, others with fear, but none dared interfere. Old Marin, who had known Lyra since childhood, lowered her eyes instead of meeting hers. That silent gesture hurt more than the ropes tightening around her wrists. As the soldiers marched her through the village, past the well, past the little bakery, past every familiar face that suddenly felt like a stranger's, a terrible certainty settled deep inside her. Whatever awaited her, it wasn't justice. No one was taking her to stand before a judge. They walked for hours beneath a merciless sun, the village disappearing behind shimmering waves of heat until it no longer existed, except in Lyra's memory. The coarse rope around her wrists rubbed her skin raw with every step, leaving thin trails of blood she no longer had the strength to notice. No one offered her water. No one spoke a single word. The silence of the soldiers frightened her far more than insults ever could. She watched the mountains that had framed her entire life shrink into the distance before vanishing completely beyond the horizon. Her legs trembled with exhaustion, and every breath burned inside her dry throat. She kept walking because stopping felt even more terrifying than continuing. Arrests ended behind prison walls. Trials ended in courtrooms. This journey had neither destination nor mercy. As the endless sea of sand stretched farther in every direction, Lyra finally understood that they were walking toward a place from which no one was ever expected to return. Near sunset, they reached a lonely, dead tree rising from the cracked earth, like the skeleton of something ancient that had died waiting for rain. Without ceremony, the soldiers forced her against its trunk. Heavy iron chains wrapped around her wrists and locked into place with a cold, metallic click that echoed across the empty desert. One of the younger soldiers hesitated. His hands shook as he checked the lock once, then again, then a third time, unable to meet her eyes. "Please," Lyra whispered, her voice breaking, "tell me what I've done." His lips parted as though he wanted to answer, but fear won. He stepped back with the others, mounted his horse, and rode away without looking behind him. The sound of hooves faded into silence until only the wind remained. Lyra pulled desperately against the chains. The iron never moved. As darkness slowly swallowed the desert, the truth settled over her more heavily than the chains themselves. They had never intended to imprison her. They had brought her here for only one purpose, to leave her behind until the desert claimed what they had chosen not to kill themselves. The blazing heat surrendered to an unforgiving cold the moment the sun disappeared beyond the dunes. Lyra fought until there was nothing left to give. She twisted against the chains until fresh blood ran down her wrists. She screamed for help until her voice became little more than a whisper carried away by the wind. Finally she prayed, quietly at first, then desperately, begging God not necessarily to save her life, but simply not to let her die believing she had been forgotten. No answer came. Eventually even the tears stopped. She rested her head against the rough bark and closed her eyes, accepting that the next sunrise would probably rise over her lifeless body. Then she heard it, a faint sound across the sand. Barely audible, she forced her heavy eyelids open and saw a tiny white wolf cautiously approaching her. His pale fur almost glowed beneath the moonlight as he stopped only a few feet away, studying her with curious blue-gray eyes. Slowly he stepped closer, sniffed her trembling hand, then gently pressed his cold nose against her palm before licking the cuts on her wrist. Lyra managed the faintest smile. "Go," she whispered weakly. "Please, don't stay here. I don't want you to die too." The little wolf didn't obey. Instead, he stared at her for several long seconds, almost as though he understood every word. Then, without warning, he turned and disappeared into the darkness, running faster than she'd thought such a small creature possibly could. Lyra watched until he vanished beyond the dunes. Even that tiny spark of hope, she thought, had abandoned her at last. Ghost raced across the moonlit desert without slowing, his small paws barely touching the sand. Miles away, Kael Draven sat alone upon a rocky cliff overlooking the endless dunes, exactly where he often escaped whenever memories of the palace became too heavy to bear. The little wolf burst from the darkness, panting, whining urgently, as he grabbed the edge of Kael's cloak with his teeth and pulled with surprising determination. Kael frowned. Ghost had never behaved like this before. At first, he thought the young wolf had found an injured animal, but Ghost refused to let go, pacing in frantic circles before racing several yards away, only to return when Kael didn't immediately follow. Whatever he had found, it mattered. Without another question, Kael rose and followed him into the night. They crossed dune after dune beneath the silver light of the full moon, until Ghost suddenly stopped at the crest of a hill. Kael looked ahead. At first he saw only the silhouette of a dead tree standing alone against the horizon. Then his eyes adjusted. Someone was there, a woman, chained upright against the trunk, motionless beneath the endless sky. His heartbeat stopped. For a brief suspended moment, her exhausted emerald eyes opened just enough to meet his ice-blue gaze. Confusion, fear, relief. They all existed inside that single, fragile glance before her strength began to fail again. Rage, unlike anything Kael had felt in years, surged through him, not toward the woman before him, but toward whoever could abandon another human soul to such a death. He seized the ancient chains with both hands. For an instant the iron refused to yield. Then the metal groaned beneath a strength no ordinary man possessed. One link snapped, then another. Finally the entire chain shattered, crashing onto the sand with a deafening clang. Lyra collapsed forward, her body giving in completely as consciousness slipped away. Kael caught her before she touched the ground, lifting her gently into his arms as though she weighed nothing. Ghost wagged his tail once, then trotted ahead, glancing back every few steps to make sure they were following. Together they disappeared into the endless dunes, just as the first golden light of dawn began to spill across the horizon. Behind them, the dead tree remained alone once more, its broken chains slowly disappearing beneath the shifting desert sand, as though the world itself had decided to erase every trace that Lyra Ashwin had ever been there. When Lyra finally opened her eyes again, she would have no idea that the stranger who had carried her out of the desert was about to change not only her destiny, but the fate of an entire kingdom. Warmth reached her before anything else did, a low crackle and the smell of wood smoke pulling her back from somewhere dark and formless. Lyra heard water running nearby, steady and rhythmic, and for one disoriented moment, she was certain she had died, certain this quiet, gentle sound was whatever came after. Then her eyes opened, slowly, and instead of sky, she found stone, uneven and shadowed, curving above her in a shape that took her several seconds to understand as a ceiling. A cave. She tried to sit up and pain answered immediately, sharp and total, radiating from her wrists down through every limb she owned. A soft weight shifted beside her, and she turned to find a small white wolf watching her with bright, attentive eyes. Relief broke over her so suddenly she nearly laughed. Then her gaze moved past him, across the low fire, and found a man sitting on the other side of it, still, silent, watching her without a word. Every muscle in her body went tense at once. He didn't move toward her, didn't speak first. He simply reached for a water skin, crossed the space between them at an unhurried pace, and set it within her reach, before retreating back to his side of the fire. Food followed a few minutes later, a piece of bread and some dried meat, offered the same way. Without comment, without waiting for thanks, Lyra watched him carefully, waiting for the questions she assumed would come. The demands, the price always attached to kindness like this. They never came. "Why did you save me?" she finally asked, her voice rough and unfamiliar in her own ears. Kael glanced up, considered the question longer than she expected, then answered simply, because leaving you there wasn't an option. He returned to the wood he'd been splitting beside the fire, unbothered, uninterested in explaining further, and Lyra found herself staring at his back, more curious about him now than she'd been about anything in a very long time. The days that followed settled into something quiet and unhurried. Ghost chased shadows near the cave entrance while Cale moved through small, practical tasks, cooking over the low fire, sharpening tools worn dull from use, checking the bindings on Lyra's wrists with careful, unbothered hands. She watched him from where she rested, piecing together a picture from fragments, because he offered almost nothing outright. He spoke little. His eyes never lingered on her longer than necessary. He never once asked where she'd come from, what she'd done, why soldiers had chained her to a dying tree. He simply left space for her to exist without explanation, and somewhere in that space, something in Lyra began, cautiously, to loosen. She hadn't realized how long she'd been braced for danger until she noticed, one afternoon, that she wasn't anymore, not around him. She started paying closer attention to his routine after that, the way he rose before the light fully broke, disappearing to hunt or gather water, returning always with exactly what was needed, and nothing more. He repaired a section of the cave's collapsed roof without being asked, feeding Ghost before feeding himself, moving through each task with the quiet competence of someone who had done all of it alone for a very long time. Too long, she thought, watching him work in silence one afternoon. Whatever pain lived behind his eyes, it looked to her disturbingly familiar. "How long have you lived here?" she asked, testing the edges of whatever wall he kept around himself. Kyle didn't look up from the wood in his hands. "Long enough," he said, and offered nothing more, the vagueness of it settling over her like another locked door she wasn't yet permitted to open. Night came, and with it, the fire burned lower, casting long shadows across the cave walls. Ghost curled between them, asleep, a small warm boundary neither of them acknowledged out loud. For the first time since she'd woken in that cave, the silence between them didn't feel like distance. It felt almost comfortable. Lyra studied him across the dying flames, really studied him this time, and noticed things she hadn't let herself notice before. The way he moved, controlled and deliberate, nothing wasted. The strength in his hands that had nothing to do with a life of simple hunting. The way he spoke, when he spoke at all, in a manner too careful, too measured, for someone who claimed to live alone in the wild with nothing to his name. None of it added up to the man he wanted her to believe he was. "Who are you?" she asked quietly, watching him closely now. "Really?" Kyle lifted his eyes slowly from the fire, and for the first time since she'd woken in that cave, something shifted behind them, something he hadn't meant to let show. The fire had burned low by the time silence settled naturally between them. Outside the hidden cave, dawn slowly awakened the desert, painting the distant cliffs with soft shades of gold, while a cool breeze drifted through the narrow entrance. Ghost slept peacefully beside the fading embers, occasionally twitching in his dreams, completely unaware of the conversation that was about to change everything. Lyra sat quietly across from Cale, studying him in the warm firelight. The more she watched him, the more impossible he became to understand. He carried himself with the confidence of a trained warrior, moved with the discipline of someone raised among nobility, and possessed a quiet authority that no ordinary wanderer could ever fake. Yet he lived alone in a forgotten cave, hiding from a kingdom that seemed to have erased him from its memory. Finally, unable to silence her curiosity any longer, she looked into his pale blue eyes and asked softly, "Who are you? Really?" Kyle remained silent for several moments. His gaze never left the dying flames, as though every answer had been buried inside that fire years ago. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, but heavy with memories he had spent a lifetime trying to forget. "My name is Cale Draven," he whispered, "and I am the only son of Alpha King Theron." For a moment Lyra forgot how to breathe. She searched his face, expecting to find some trace of humor or deception, but there was only sadness. Every story she had ever heard about the royal family rushed through her mind. The Alpha King was known throughout the kingdom as a fearless ruler whose strength had united the werewolf clans after years of war. Songs praised his victories. Soldiers swore loyalty in his name. Children dreamed of one day serving under his command. Yet no one had ever spoken of a prince named Cale. It was as though the future heir had never existed. Seeing the confusion in Lyra's eyes, Kyle gave a faint, weary smile. "That is because my father made sure no one would remember me." His voice never rose in anger. There was only quiet acceptance, the kind born from carrying the same wound for far too many years. Then, after another long silence, he told her the story he had never shared with anyone else. "My mother was Queen Elowyn," Kyle began, his eyes fixed on the dancing flames. "She died the night I was born. The kingdom had celebrated the arrival of its prince while mourning the woman every citizen had loved. The greatest healers had fought until their very last breath to save her, but nothing could stop the complications that followed his birth. Theron never blamed the physicians. He never blamed fate. Instead, every time he looked into the eyes of his newborn son, he saw the face of the child who had taken away the love of his life. He never called me a monster," Kyle said quietly. "Sometimes I almost wish he had. At least hatred is honest." Instead, Theron buried himself in duty and ruled his kingdom with unmatched discipline, while leaving his son to grow up surrounded by servants, tutors, and guards, but never by affection. Kyle received the finest education, mastered every weapon expected of a future alpha, and learned to lead before most boys had become men. Yet throughout all those years, he could not remember a single embrace from his father, or one moment when Theron had looked at him with pride instead of silent grief. Living inside the palace had been lonelier than any wilderness he would later call home. "When I became old enough to understand the truth," Kyle continued, "I stopped trying to earn his love. There had been no great argument, no dramatic farewell, and no public exile. One quiet morning, before the kingdom awoke, he simply mounted his horse and rode north without telling anyone where he was going. Theron never sent soldiers to bring him back. No royal decree demanded the prince's return. Days became months, and months became years, until the kingdom slowly accepted that the Alpha King's son had simply vanished. Kyle built a life far from castles and politics, learning to survive among mountains, forests, and deserts, where no one cared about bloodlines or royal titles. Nearly 5 years earlier, while crossing the northern woods, he had found a starving white wolf pup abandoned beside the body of its mother. The tiny creature was weak enough to fit inside both of his hands, yet it refused to stop fighting for life. "I suppose we rescued each other," Kyle said with a gentle smile, as Ghost wandered sleepily toward him and leaned against his leg. "Since then, neither of us has ever been alone again." Tears quietly filled Lyra's emerald eyes. As she looked at the man sitting across from her, she realized that despite everything separating their lives, they carried the same invisible wound. She had been abandoned beneath a dying tree because someone had decided her life no longer mattered. Kyle had been abandoned inside a palace where everyone could see him, yet no one truly loved him. Without thinking, she reached across the fire and gently placed her hand over his. This time, Kyle did not pull away. For the first time in many years, the silence between them no longer felt empty. It felt safe. Neither of them noticed the wind shifting outside the cave or the distant howl echoing across the cliffs. Far away, inside the royal capital, Alpha King Theron Dreven stood alone on the highest balcony of his castle, staring toward the northern horizon with the same haunted expression he had worn for years, unaware that destiny had already begun leading his forgotten son back into his life. Theron Dreven walked through his own palace like a man walking toward a war he hadn't chosen, his boots striking the stone floor in a rhythm that made every servant in his path flatten against the walls. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. 24 years of silence had taught the entire household to read the set of his jaw, and right now, that jaw was carved from something colder than anger. Bram trailed several steps behind, already regretting the confidence that had carried him into the throne room that morning, watching the king's shoulders as if they might explain what was coming. Word of his fury hadn't even reached the East Wing yet, but Theron didn't care about warnings. He wanted to see it himself, whatever his son had done, whatever secret had been kept beneath his own roof without his knowledge. His mind ran through possibilities and rejected each one. None of them prepared him for what waited behind that door. He stopped outside the sealed wing, hand resting against the old wood, and for one strange moment hesitated. That hesitation surprised even him. Theron had spent 24 years perfecting the art of walking into rooms and demanding answers, and yet here, outside a door his own son had chosen to hide behind, something made him pause. Perhaps it was the quiet on the other side, low voices and soft laughter that didn't belong to a scene of deception. Perhaps it was something older, some buried instinct he'd long stopped trusting. Whatever it was, instead of throwing the door open and demanding explanations, Theron stepped back into the shadow of the adjoining corridor, gesturing sharply for Bram to stay silent. He would see this for himself, unannounced, before he decided what kind of punishment his son had earned. Bram opened his mouth to protest, then thought better of it, retreating into the darkness alongside his king. Through the gap in the door, Theron watched, and what he saw was not at all what he had braced himself to find. Kyle knelt beside the bed, unwrapping bandages from a young woman's wrist with a care so deliberate it looked almost reverent. His hands moved slowly, checking each wound before applying fresh linen, his voice low as he asked her quietly whether it hurt. She shook her head, though the wince that crossed her face said otherwise, and Kyle's mouth pulled into the faintest smile, the kind that suggested he'd caught the lie and let it pass out of kindness. When he finished, he broke a piece of bread in half without hesitation and offered her the larger portion, keeping the smaller piece for himself, as though it hadn't even occurred to him to do otherwise. Theron watched his son's hands, steady and unhurried, and felt something unfamiliar twist in his chest. He had expected recklessness. He had expected some careless, selfish disregard for the rules of his household. What he found instead looked disturbingly like tenderness. Ghost quietly crossed the room and rested his head on Kyle's knee. Without interrupting the conversation, Kyle absently scratched behind the wolf's ears while continuing to help Lyra with her bandages, and Ghost closed his eyes in quiet contentment, completely certain he was exactly where he belonged. Theron stayed longer than he intended, unable to look away. He watched Agnes enter with a tray of food and watched Kyle rise immediately to help her carry it, waving off her protests with an ease that suggested this wasn't new behavior, only something Theron had simply never witnessed. He watched his son thank her by name, ask after her aching knee, insist she sit for a moment before returning to her duties. It was such a small thing. It shouldn't have mattered. And yet, Theron found himself cataloguing every instance of it, every soft word, every unnecessary kindness extended to people who owed Kyle nothing and expected nothing in return. This was not the behavior of a boy raised without love, without guidance, without a father's attention. Or perhaps, Theron thought with a discomfort he couldn't quite name, it was exactly that. Perhaps kindness like this only grew in places starved of it, reaching toward light because it had never been given any. It was the woman's laugh that undid him completely. Something Kyle said, quiet and teasing, made her laugh out loud, unguarded and bright, and Kyle's whole face changed in response. Some tension Theron hadn't even realized his son carried easing out of his shoulders. And there, in that unremarkable moment, in a forgotten room, in a forgotten wing of his own palace, Theron saw something that stopped his breath entirely. The tilt of his son's head, the particular warmth in his eyes when he looked at someone he'd chosen to care for. It was Elowyn, not her face, not her voice, but something in the manner, some inherited gentleness Theron had convinced himself for 24 years had died with her. He gripped the doorframe to steady himself, the throne room's fury draining out of him and leaving something far more dangerous behind. Grief, fresh, sharp, and 24 years overdue. Theron stepped back from the door before either of them could see him, his legs carrying him down the corridor on instinct alone, his mind unable to settle on a single coherent thought. He had come here ready to punish disobedience. He was leaving with the growing, unbearable suspicion that he had spent nearly a quarter-century punishing the wrong person for a death that had never been anyone's fault at all. Bram fell into step behind him, opening his mouth to ask what the king intended to do, then closing it again at the look on Theron's face, an expression he had never once seen the Alpha King wear. Not rage, not judgment, something that looked unmistakably like a man beginning to drown in his own guilt. Theron didn't return to the throne room. He didn't summon guards. He didn't order Kyle's arrest. Instead, he turned toward the oldest quarters of the palace, toward Agnes, because if there was one person who had witnessed every silent wound his family had carried for the last 24 years, it was the woman who had raised the son he had spent 24 years refusing to know. Word reached Kyle that his father had left for a neighboring Pax territory, a routine matter of borders and treaties that would keep him away for days, and for the first time since bringing Lyra into the palace, Something in Kyle's chest loosened enough to breathe freely. "He's gone until the end of the week," he told her, watching her face for the flicker of relief he knew would be there. It was. Lyra had been confined to that small, forgotten room for what felt like a lifetime. Her wounds healed enough now to walk without wincing, her strength returning in slow, steady increments. "There's a garden," Kyle said, almost hesitant, as though offering something fragile. "No one uses it anymore. It would be safe." Lyra's eyes lit with something he hadn't seen from her yet. Not gratitude, not relief, but genuine, uncomplicated want. "Show me," she said, and Kyle found himself smiling in a way that felt unfamiliar on his own face, out of practice from years of having little reason to use it. Ghost reached the garden first, tearing ahead the moment the old gate creaked open, as though he'd been waiting his whole life for permission to run wild through it. Lyra laughed and took off after him without thinking, her bare feet quick against the overgrown path. And Kyle, caught entirely off guard, broke into a run behind them both, calling out something about waiting for him that neither of them obeyed. The garden had been forgotten by everyone except the vines that had reclaimed it. Wild roses climbing walls no one bothered to prune, ivy softening stone that once stood sharp and formal. Lyra stopped beneath an archway, turning in a slow circle, taking in color and sunlight after weeks confined to a single dim room. "It's beautiful," she breathed. Kyle reached her side, slightly out of breath, and without thinking, brushed a stray leaf from her shoulder where it had caught in the chase, his hand lingering half a second longer than the gesture required. Neither of them mentioned it. Both of them noticed. Ghost returned a moment later, a small stick clamped proudly in his mouth, and dropped it directly at Kale's feet, with an expectant look. Kale laughed and threw it across the garden, and Ghost sprinted after it with the reckless joy of something far younger than he was. Lyra laughed so hard she had to wipe tears from the corners of her eyes, and Kyle laughed with her, easy and unguarded, a sound that surprised even himself. "He likes you more than he likes me," Kale said, feigning offense as Ghost trotted back and dropped the stick at Lyra's feet instead this time. "That's because I don't make him fetch things," Lyra shot back, setting the stick aside and watching Ghost immediately abandon her to circle Kyle's legs instead, undermining her point entirely. They fell into step together along the garden path, Ghost weaving between them like he was stitching the three of them into something whole. "You're different out here," Lyra said quietly, studying him. "Lighter." Kyle considered that for a moment. "I don't get to feel light very often," he admitted. "Neither do I," Lyra said. "Maybe that's why it feels so easy with you." Theron had been standing at the garden's edge for longer than he meant to, half hidden by an old stone archway, unable to make himself step forward or leave. He had returned earlier than expected, his business concluded faster than anticipated, and something had drawn him toward this forgotten corner of the grounds instead of straight to his chambers. He told himself it was curiosity. He suspected it was something closer to hope, fragile and unfamiliar, the kind he'd stopped allowing himself years ago. He watched his son help the young woman over a low stone step, his hand steady at her elbow a moment longer than necessary. He watched him brush leaves from her sleeve, laugh at something she said, throw a stick for the wolf with the easy carelessness of someone who had never once worried about being watched. Theron stood there, unmoving, and let himself witness every second of it. Unwilling to disturb something he was only beginning to understand, he had no right to interrupt. Watching them, Theron felt the weight of every year crash into him at once. He had built a fortress of grief around himself the day Elowen died, brick by brick, year by year, and somewhere in that construction he had convinced himself that keeping his son at a distance was a kind of protection for both of them, from a bond he no longer believed himself capable of. He searched his memory desperately, reaching back through year after year of clipped conversations and empty dinners, and found nothing. He couldn't remember the last time he had seen Kyle smile. Watching him now, radiant with a happiness Theron had never given him room to feel, he understood with sudden, devastating clarity what he had actually built. Not protection, a prison, and his son had been serving a sentence for a crime he never committed. Theron's throat tightened around something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in 24 years. Grief wrapped so tightly around guilt that he could no longer tell where one ended and the other began. Lyra was the one who noticed him first, the shift in Kale's expression alerting her before she even turned to look. Kale went rigid beside her, every trace of ease vanishing from his face in an instant. replaced by the familiar, practiced bracing of a boy who had spent his whole life waiting for disappointment. "Father," he said, his voice carefully flat, giving nothing away. Theron stepped out from beneath the archway, and for one unbearable moment, no one moved. No one spoke. Then, slowly, Ghost crossed the garden on his own, unhurried, and sat down beside the Alpha King. The little wolf looked up at him, then turned his gaze back toward Kyle, patient and certain, as though inviting the one man in that garden too proud to move on his own to finally cross the distance he had spent 24 years refusing to close. For the first time in 24 years, Theron took a step toward his son. Kyle didn't sleep that night, replaying the moment over and over, the sight of his father's hand lifting halfway toward his shoulder before falling still again, uncertain, unfinished. Neither of them had spoken more than a few strained words in the garden before Theron turned and walked back toward the palace alone, leaving Kyle standing there with Lyra's hand still in his, and no idea what any of it meant. "He looked at you like he'd never seen you before," Lyra said quietly, once they were back in the small forgotten room, Ghost curled between them on the floor. "Maybe he hasn't," Kyle admitted, staring at nothing. "Not really. Not in a long time." He braced himself for the worst, certain that whatever silence followed would end in punishment, in banishment, in his father finally finding a reason to be rid of him entirely. Lyra reached over and took his hand again, saying nothing, because there was nothing to say that would make the waiting any easier. Theron did not go to the throne room. He did not summon guards or draft an order for his son's arrest. Instead, his feet carried him, almost without his permission, toward the oldest quarters of the palace, past rooms that hadn't changed in 24 years, until he stood outside a door he hadn't knocked on with any real purpose in longer than he could remember. Agnes opened it before he raised his hand, as though some old instinct had warned her he was coming. She looked at him for a long moment, taking in whatever was written across his face, and stepped aside without a word to let him in. "You saw them," she said. It wasn't a question. Theron lowered himself into the single chair by her small hearth, looking suddenly older than his years, the weight of the crown seeming, for once, secondary to the weight of everything else. "Tell me the truth," he said. "All of it. I should have asked you this 24 years ago." Agnes was quiet for a long moment, her hands folding themselves in her lap the way they always did when she was choosing her words with care. "I was in the room when Elowen died," she said finally. "You remember that. What you don't remember, because you couldn't bear to hear it then, is what she said before she went." She rose slowly and crossed to an old chest tucked beneath the window, lifting out a small wooden box, worn smooth by years of careful handling. "I kept these," she said, setting it in his lap, "because I knew one day someone would finally be ready to see them." Theron opened it with unsteady hands. Inside lay a newborn's woven bracelet, a small folded blanket gone soft with age, a single dried flower pressed flat, and a narrow strip of ribbon with a few words stitched along its length in Elowen's careful hand. He read them once, then again, his breath catching somewhere in his chest. "If our son ever believes I left because of him, tell him I left loving him." "She wasn't afraid, Theron," Agnes said quietly, watching him hold the ribbon like it might disappear if he loosened his grip. "Not of dying. She was afraid of what would happen to him after. Her last words weren't a blame. They were a plea. And you were so buried in your own grief that you never once asked what she actually said. You built 24 years of silence on an assumption, not a truth." The words landed like something physical, and Theron sat with them, unable to speak for a long moment. "I thought," he started, then stopped, then tried again. "I thought if I let myself love him, it would mean admitting she was really gone, that loving him meant grieving her all over again, every single day." His voice cracked slightly on the last word. 24 years of carefully constructed control finally giving way, so instead I punished the only piece of her I had left. Agnes didn't offer comfort. Not yet. She let the silence sit, let him feel the full weight of what he'd just admitted out loud for the first time. "He never once blamed you for any of it," she said eventually. "Do you understand that? He grew up believing he didn't deserve you, and he never once let himself hate you for it. That boy has more of his mother in him than you've allowed yourself to see." Agnes remained silent for another moment, her gaze fixed on the dying fire before speaking again. "There is something else you need to know." Theron looked up. "The girl." He frowned. Lyra. Agnes nodded slowly. I've spent years listening to servants, guards, and travelers. People speak more freely than they realize when they believe no one important is listening. She drew a slow breath. Lyra was never condemned because she committed a crime. Theron's brow furrowed. Then why was she left to die? Because she witnessed one. Agnes explained that months earlier, Lyra had unknowingly crossed paths with several influential men meeting in secret beyond the kingdom's borders. They had been discussing illegal dealings with rival pacts, trading supplies and information that could have endangered Theron's kingdom if discovered. Lyra had heard enough to recognize faces before being seen herself. She wasn't important enough to imprison, nor powerful enough to bargain with. Making her disappear quietly was simply easier. The men who chained her to that tree weren't acting under your authority, Agnes said softly. They were carrying out someone else's orders. For a long moment, Theron didn't move. Then his voice became frighteningly calm. Find every person involved. There was no anger in his tone now, only justice. Theron sat with that for a long time after Agnes fell silent, the fire in her small hearth burning low, casting shifting shadows across a face that looked, for once, entirely unguarded. He thought of the garden, of Cale's hand steadying Lyra over uneven stone, of the sound of his son's laughter, a sound he'd genuinely forgotten the shape of until today. He thought of the small white wolf sitting beside him, looking between them both, patient in a way Theron himself had never managed to be. Something inside him, buried under 2.5 decades of grief mistaken for grievance, finally settled into a decision. He rose from the chair, steadier than when he'd sat down, and looked at Agnes with something that might have been the beginning of gratitude. Tomorrow, he said quietly, I want to see my son. Agnes allowed herself the smallest smile, the kind worn by someone who had waited 24 years to hear those exact words. Kyle was in the garden again the next morning, alone this time, sitting on the same low stone wall where he'd once watched Lyra chase Ghost through the overgrown grass. He hadn't slept, and it showed in the shadows beneath his eyes, in the restless way his hands kept finding things to do, straightening his sleeves, retying his boots, anything to keep from sitting still with his own dread. When he heard footsteps on the gravel path, he braced instinctively, already rehearsing the apology he assumed he'd need. But it wasn't a guard. It was his father, alone, no crown, no ceremony, just a man walking slowly toward him with something unreadable written across his face. Will you walk with me? Theron asked, and it wasn't a command, wasn't even close to one. It was, Kyle realized with a strange jolt, something closer to a request. He rose without a word, and the two of them started down the garden path together, side by side, in a silence that felt different from every silence that had come before it. Kyle braced himself for the conversation to turn, waiting for the familiar shift in his father's voice, the coldness that always arrived eventually no matter how the conversation began. It didn't come. Theron walked with his hands clasped behind his back, his eyes fixed somewhere in the middle distance, and for a long stretch, neither of them spoke at all. I'm not going to pretend I have the right words, Theron said finally, his voice rougher than usual. I've had 24 years to find them, and I never did. Kyle's chest tightened, certain now that whatever came next would be the sentence he'd been dreading his entire life. He kept his eyes forward, jaw set, prepared to absorb it the way he'd absorbed every disappointment before it. But the silence that followed wasn't cold. It was heavy in a different way entirely, thick with something Cale didn't have a name for yet, something that felt impossibly like his father was struggling not to break. Agnes told me the truth, Theron said, stopping beneath the same archway where he'd stood hidden days before. About your mother, about what she actually said before she died. Kyle went very still. He had never once been told anything about his mother's final words, had spent his whole life assuming, without ever being told outright, that they had been an accusation. She never blamed you, Theron continued, his voice unsteady now, stripped of every ounce of authority it usually carried. She asked Agnes to make sure you were loved. That was her last wish, and I was too consumed by my own grief to ever ask what she'd actually said. I built a wall around both of us based on a lie I told myself, and I let you grow up on the other side of it, believing you'd done something unforgivable, simply by being born. Kyle's eyes burned, and he blinked hard, refusing to let the tears fall in front of a man who had never once seen him cry. I don't expect you to forgive me, Theron said, his voice finally breaking on the words. "I don't think I could forgive myself if our places were switched. But I need you to know that I never stopped loving you, even when I couldn't show it. Even when everything I did made it look like the opposite was true. I was drowning, Kyle, and instead of reaching for you, I let you drown beside me alone for 24 years. Kyle's breath caught somewhere in his throat, every wall he'd spent a lifetime building suddenly feeling impossibly fragile. "You could have just told me," he managed, his voice cracking despite every effort to keep it steady. "Any of it, any small piece of it." "I know," Theron said. "I know. And there's no excuse good enough to explain why I didn't." He took a step closer, hesitant, the way a man moves towards something he's afraid of breaking. Then, slowly, he opened his arms. Kyle stared at him. 24 years told him not to move. 24 years told him this wasn't real. 24 years told him the warmth would disappear the moment he reached for it. Theron didn't lower his arms. He simply waited, for as long as his son needed. Kyle took one step, then another, and finally, he let himself be held. Theron's arms closed around him, firm and certain, and for a long moment neither of them said anything at all, because there was nothing left to say that the embrace itself wasn't already saying better. "I'm sorry," Theron whispered against his son's shoulder, his voice thick with 24 years of grief finally finding somewhere to go. "I'm so sorry, Kyle. I should have held you like this 1,000 times before now." From the garden's edge, Lyra watched with her hand pressed against her chest, tears slipping freely down her face. Ghost sitting silently beside her, as though he too understood the weight of what he was witnessing. The little white wolf quietly rose, trotted across the grass, and settled at the feet of both father and son, resting his head across their boots, as though making certain neither of them would ever stand apart again. Lyra thought of the woman chained beneath a dying tree in the desert, certain she would never see another sunrise, and felt something settle deep inside her, a quiet, overwhelming sense that everything, every terrible thing that had led her here, had led her to exactly this moment. Word of what happened in the garden spread through the palace by evening, servants whispering it to one another in corridors that had spent 24 years accustomed to silence between father and son. And though no announcement was made, though no formal proclamation marked the moment, everyone within those walls understood that something in the kingdom had shifted permanently, that the Alpha King and his once-rejected son had finally, after 2.5 decades, found their way back to each other. Lyra healed fully in the weeks that followed, though healed felt like too small a word for everything that had changed inside her since the desert. She no longer flinched at footsteps in the corridor. She no longer woke expecting chains. Theron insisted, over her quiet protests, that she remain in the palace as a guest of honor rather than a secret hidden in a forgotten wing, and the first time she walked through the main halls in daylight, openly, without fear of discovery, she had to stop for a moment, just to let herself feel it. Agnes caught her in that pause, smiling the particular smile of a woman who had waited a long time to see something like peace settle over this household. "You did more for this family in a few weeks," Agnes said, "than most people manage in a lifetime." Lyra shook her head, uncertain how to accept praise for simply surviving, but Agnes only patted her hand and said nothing more, because some truths didn't need arguing. The kingdom learned the truth gradually, the way important things often spread, first in whispers, then openly, until there was no version of the story left untold. Theron called for a formal gathering of the pack elders, and standing before them with Kale at his side, he did something no one in that hall had ever expected to witness. He named his son, publicly and without reservation, as the true heir to the Alpha throne. There was no mention of old rumors, no lingering shadow of blame, only a father's voice, steady and certain, declaring what should have been obvious for 24 years. Kyle stood through it with his jaw tight and his eyes bright, and when the elders bowed, one by one, he felt something settle into place inside him that he hadn't known was missing until that exact moment, a sense of belonging he'd spent a lifetime being told he didn't deserve. Theron and Kyle found their way slowly, the way real repair always happens, not in one grand gesture, but in 1,000 small ones stacked carefully on top of each other. Morning walks that turned into real conversations, meals no longer eaten in separate wings of the palace. Theron asking awkwardly at first about Kyle's days, his thoughts, the things that made him laugh, learning his own son as though meeting him for the first time, which in some ways he was. There were still hard days. Old habits didn't disappear just because the truth had finally surfaced, and there were moments when silence crept back in out of instinct rather than intention. But now, when it did, one of them reached across it instead of letting it grow. "We're not going to get back 24 years, Theron told him one evening, watching the sunset paint the garden gold. "No," Kyle agreed, "but we have all the ones still coming." What began between Kale and Lyra, as gratitude, as survival, as two people finding safety in each other during the worst nights of their lives, had grown into something neither of them could deny any longer. It showed in small things. The way Kyle's hand found hers without either of them deciding it should. The way Lyra had started leaving her door unlocked, an unspoken invitation neither of them acknowledged out loud, but both of them understood completely. One evening in the garden, beneath the same archway where Theron had once stood watching them from the shadows, Kale finally said what they'd both been circling for weeks. "I don't know what I would have become," he said quietly, "if Ghost hadn't found you that night." Lyra reached up and touched his face, something fierce and certain in her eyes. "I think about that too," she said, "but I don't think it was chance. I think some things are just meant to find each other." Kyle was quiet for a moment, something vulnerable crossing his face. "I'm afraid of losing this," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Lyra smiled softly, her hand covering his. "Then don't let go." Kyle kissed her then, slow and certain, the kind of kiss that carried the weight of everything they'd survived to get there. Ghost never strayed far from either of them, trotting between Kyle and Lyra through every garden walk, curling at the foot of whichever bed needed guarding on a given night, sitting at Theron's feet during council meetings, as though he'd appointed himself protector of the whole reconciled family. He had grown from an unlikely pup abandoned by his own pack into something the entire household had come to recognize as more than an animal, a quiet thread woven through every turning point that mattered. Agnes liked to say, half joking and half entirely serious, that the little wolf had done more to save this family than anyone with a crown ever had. No one in the palace disagreed with her. Kyle certainly didn't, watching Ghost chase butterflies through the garden with the same reckless joy he'd carried since he was small. Still, after everything, exactly the same loyal, stubborn creature who had once refused to let a tired, grieving young man turn away from the one thing that would save them all. Some kingdoms are saved by kings. Some are saved by warriors, by armies, by grand declarations made from thrones. This one was saved by a woman who refused to die quietly in the desert, by a rejected son who chose kindness even when no one had ever shown it to him, by an old woman who kept a promise for 24 years without once being asked to, by a father who finally found the courage to face his own grief instead of hiding behind it. And it was saved, in the smallest and most unexpected way of all, by the tiniest wolf in the entire kingdom, the one who refused to walk away from a woman chained beneath a dying tree, and in doing so led an entire broken family back to each other. What began as a story about abandonment became, in the end, a story about the families we choose to build from the wreckage of the ones that failed us. Proof that even the coldest hearts, given enough time and enough truth, can still learn how to love. Years later, travelers would sometimes ask why a white wolf always slept beneath the oldest oak in the palace gardens. No one ever gave exactly the same answer. Some said he was guarding the future Alpha. Others believed he was watching over the woman he had once refused to leave behind. Agnes always smiled before saying the same thing. "No," she'd say, "he's making sure this family never gets lost again. Not every family begins with love. Some begin with silence, misunderstanding, and wounds that seem impossible to heal." Kyle spent 24 years believing he was unwanted. Theron spent those same years imprisoned by a grief he never found the courage to confront. Lyra believed her life would end alone beneath a dying tree, abandoned by the very kingdom she once called home. And Ghost, the smallest wolf in the kingdom, proved that sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones no one expects. In the end, it wasn't power that saved this family. It wasn't a crown, an army, or even destiny. It was compassion, forgiveness, and the courage to take the first step toward someone after years of pain. One act of kindness changed 3 broken lives forever. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel, because every new subscriber helps us continue sharing stories of hope, redemption, and second chances. And before you leave, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Which moment moved you the most? The moment Ghost refused to abandon Lyra in the desert, or the father's very first embrace with his son after 24 years? Thank you so much for watching, and until our next story, take care of yourself and never stop believing that even the deepest wounds can become the beginning of something beautiful.